Hello, in this video I'll show you how I made a vinyl wine list. I started with a free image of a wine glass. I loaded the image into my Pixelmator editor, then made everything one color and deleted the background. Then I added a rectangle to break the space between the top half and bottom half of the wine glass so that I can delete the top half later and make it look like the glass has wine in it. Then I selected the top half of the wine glass and used Ctrl-C to copy and Ctrl-V to paste as a new layer. I made this new layer smaller and then centered it in the top portion of the wine glass. Then I used my eraser tool with this layer still highlighted and erased the background. When I drag this layer out of the way, you can see that it's now blank space behind it. I delete this layer and I'm left with a two-dimensional ring around the wine glass. Now I need to add some color to the inside of the wine glass so it looks like it has wine in it. I use a white paintbrush to paint some lines around the rim, and this will help me select a new area to copy and paste. Just as before, I paste the new layer and decrease the size so that it fits inside the wine glass. I want there to be a gap between the edge of the glass and the wine so that it will look nice when it's cut in vinyl. Then I use my paintbrush to fill in the empty space. I use the left bracket on my keyboard to make the paintbrush size smaller and the right bracket on the keyboard to make this paintbrush size larger. I also paint back over the white lines that I had previously painted just so everything is the same color. Now I want to add some reflections in the wine glass that will be cut out in vinyl. These two reflections are brush strokes that I made in another Pixelmator screen so that I could copy and paste them as layers. Once I have the reflections positioned the way I like, I save the image as a PNG file so I can load it to Cricut Design Space. Once in Cricut Design Space, I upload the image and review to see if there's any parts that need to be cut out. I intentionally left the reflections colored so I can show how to edit that in Cricut Design Space, but it's also possible to erase those in Pixelmator or any other photo editing tool. To delete these reflections in Cricut Design Space, use the Select tool and click on the colors. You should see the pixels behind the colors now, which shows that it's now empty space. I'll do the rest of the design work in Cricut Design Space. I want this decal to have a wine list for both red wine and white wine, and I want it to be in order from dry to sweet. I found a couple wine lists online that I'm referencing to type in these wine names. This decal is going on a wood cabinet, and I decided to use removable vinyl for the decal. Heat transfer vinyl and permanent vinyl is often recommended when working on wood, but I tested the cabinet and the removable vinyl that I have worked really well. It also didn't pull any paint off, and I wanted to have that flexibility in case I messed up the design or wanted to change it in a couple weeks or months. Once I have the list of wines typed in, I filter by different fonts to choose the font that I want. Once I have a font that I like selected, I'm going to size my image. The cabinet is 21 by 24 inches, so I insert a square with those dimensions. Then I size my text and wine glass to that box to make sure that it looks good. Then I duplicate the image and move this version off to a corner so that I can run a couple tests without having to mess up my original design. First, I'm going to cut this out in paper just to make sure that everything looks right and hold it up against the cabinet. I don't want to wear down my Cricut blade unnecessarily, so I'm only going to cut the four corners of text. I insert a rectangle and use the slice tool to delete the text that I don't want to cut. I don't edit the text in the text box because then I would lose the positioning for the text on the bottom. Once all the slicing is done, I attach everything together and click Make It. Then once I have it cut out and hold it up next to the cabinet, I'll come back and make any edits that might need to happen. Once I knew that the spacing looked good in cardstock, I wanted to cut out a couple of the words so that I could check that this was a good font for weeding. Vinyl can be very difficult to weed, especially if you're doing a lot of text, so I wanted to make sure that this was user-friendly. As it turned out, the weeding was pretty horrible, so I ended up going back into Cricut Design Space and changing the font. This is where I'm glad that I had the original design copy and pasted in the top corner because it allowed me to go back and make edits. I tried another font that ended up working pretty well, so then I changed the font for the overall design and then redid my sizing. It's also important to note that the total height of this project wasn't more than 11 inches so that it would fit on the Cricut mat. I did have to use one of the long Cricut mats because the width was over 15 inches. I checked that none of the letters got filled in when I attached everything together and then set my material to vinyl. Then I cut a piece of vinyl to size based on the dimensions that were showing on the Cricut Design Space screen and laid it onto the Cricut mat. I used a roller tool to gradually lay this down so that I didn't have any air bubbles stuck under the piece of vinyl. Then I started cutting. I did make sure to pull the Cricut machine away from the wall so that as this was cutting, the mat had enough room to come out the back of the Cricut. I removed the vinyl from the Cricut mat and I checked the back to make sure that it didn't cut all the way through to the backing. Then I taped each of the 4 corners of the vinyl down to the desk that I was working on. Then I started weeding. Even though this font was more compatible with weeding, it still took a ton of time because there were just so many intricate lines to follow. I had an easier time weeding when I would cut out the center of letters first, such as the filling in an O or an R, and then I would weed in between the letters before finally weeding the top and bottom of the letters. It was also really helpful to use an X-Acto knife to cut smaller areas to weed. Once everything was weeded, I adjusted any letters that had moved, and then I cut a piece of transfer tape to size. I laid the first couple of inches of the transfer tape down and then taped it in place, and then I used the scraper tool to slowly apply the rest of the transfer tape. Once the transfer tape was in place, I then used the scraper tool to make sure that the top of the vinyl was really well adhered. Then I flipped the vinyl and transfer tape over so that I could remove the vinyl backing. This was a very tedious process because I needed to make sure that none of the letters stuck to the vinyl. So I cut small amounts of the vinyl backing so that I could work in a couple inch sections at a time. I used the weeding tool to help hold any letters down in place that were starting to lift up with the backing. It took a while, but finally I removed the last piece of vinyl backing. Then I used the tweezers and the weeding tool to adjust any letters that had moved. It was helpful to flip the transfer tape over and look at it from the front to make sure I had the right positioning. Here is what the vinyl looked like on the transfer tape before applying it to the cabinet. I lined up the decal and then applied it to the cabinet. I used the scraper tool to go over each of the words and the wine glass to make sure that the vinyl was really well adhered to the wood. You can see that I did have a couple letters shift on me right before I applied the vinyl, such as the N in Tempranillo, but since I used removable vinyl, I'll have no problem fixing the N after I have the transfer tape off. As I pulled the transfer tape off, I had my weeding tool with me ready to hold any of the vinyl pieces in place, but it was much easier to remove this transfer tape than it was to pull the vinyl backing off earlier. I used the scissors to cut off the transfer tape once I had a large section done, and then kept removing to get the other half. And here is the finished result. It took a lot of time and patience to go through weeding each of the letters, but I really love how it turned out in the end. Thanks for watching this video on how I made a vinyl wine list. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.